afternoon and welcome to IPC Masterclass 4. Uh, Before we start, let me brief you the agenda of the day. We have the introduction to the topic and speaker by Dr. Ranga Reddy, who is the president of Infection Control Academy of India, as well as he's a professor, honorary professor in School of Medical Science, University of Hyderabad. Then we have Dr. Anup Warrior. He's the senior consultant infectious disease specialist at Aster Hospital, Kochi. After his formal presentation, we will be able to take up your questions. So you can ask in whatever channel you are visiting, YouTube, Facebook, Google Meet. And at the end, we have some words from the sponsor, Sunmed. So one disclaimer here is that this session is being recorded and it's broadcasted live on YouTube and Facebook. Your social profile will appear whenever you are asking any question or you are putting any comment. I want you to be mindful about that, and continuing your participation in this event is an acceptance of this term. Certain housekeeping rules, I think you know these things, so we can avoid, except one thing, that certificate will be given to entire series of 5 sessions, only one certificates, and you have to appear in a quiz on 29th onwards to earn your certificates. And you need to secure minimum 60% marks for that. The question will be from all the 4 sessions already conducted by the time. And these are the speaker panels which you have. And with this, I request Dr. Ranga Reddy to come forward and introduce the speaker as well as the topic, please.
Thank you very much, Pranavji. Thank you for that very important housekeeping rule. We'll try and maintain that. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, a very warm welcome to the second session of the season, Masterclass 4. Considering the fact that the new variants, new manifestations of the disease, new waves are kind of really bugging the minds of common folks as well as medical fraternity, and also every day some news about a new variant making us all jittery. We thought this series, that is COVID-19 learning from past in order to prepare for the next, should give at least some of those answers which are going to make us a little less stressed than what we were yesterday or before actually joining this session. As you all have witnessed, the first lecture of this season, the new season, was delivered by Professor GVS Murthy, who has enlightened us about the first 2 waves, lessons learned for future, more from public health and epidemiological perspective. And during his enlightening session, he talked about the dynamics, the trends, the prevention strategies, the evidence on strategies, including the lockdowns and other restrictive measures, protection against reinfection and pandemic or surge preparedness. And also he made a very beautiful statement and also as some kind of guidance for us, where he talked about the Panchatantra health for COVID, where he talked about testing, tracing, tracking, treatment, etc., etc. Today we'll have yet another enlightening session with practical aspects of clinical management of COVID-19, and also all that side effects of it, or the secondary infections, what had been in news all the time last couple of months. So today we are going to have Dr. Anup. He's going to talk about the clinical management and also the various kind of products or various kind of treatment modalities which are available directly from ground zero, because for last 18 months, I think he had been restlessly working, and he has seen it all, done it all, and he is willing actually to share his accumulated experience of last 18 tumultuous months. With those few words, without wasting much time, now let me very quickly give a brief about him, since I am given that honor to introduce him. Dr. Anup, he is a DNB FRCP. He is a fellow of Infectious Disease Society of America. He is a board certified infection control, that is CAC. He is certified in antimicrobial stewardship. He is also an ambassador for SHIA. He is a clinical supervisor for internal medicine trainee of Royal College of Physicians. He is a faculty guide for fellowship programs in infectious diseases at Medicity and also Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences at Kochi. And he is also a faculty in Diploma in Infection Prevention and Control PG program, where he has contributed to one of the courses, that is IPC 10102. With those few words of introduction to Dr. Anup, I hand over the session to him. Dr. Anup, looking forward to yet another enlightening and rocking session.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ranganreddy. So give me a moment to share my screen. So from the administrator, can you give me rights to share?
Yeah, it is already given. Please do that.
Okay, just
Yeah, it is coming up. Yeah, it is already given. Please do that.
Yeah. So can you see my presentation on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the topic for discussion today, which was assigned to me, was the newer therapeutic options for COVID-19. And before we go on to therapeutic, just a very quick review of what happened last few months. So sometime in Jan, we had this reports of a new illness, a viral pneumonia happening in Wuhan, and the close down or the lockdown in the China and those places happening first. By March, April of 2020, we had the complete world shutting down, countries sealing their borders, schools and offices closing up, and this term social distancing or physical distancing became very well known to all of us. All of us became very familiar to these masks at that time. It peaked by May, June. It started to come down in many of the countries. It was plateauing and even dropping. With this lockdown, there was a lot of mental health issues which had come up at that time, a lot of economic difficulties for all people. December, the vaccines were coming up. Vaccines were invented and the trials were getting over. However, soon after that, the vaccines are rolled out. The new variants or mutations also came to be recognized, and also with that, the fear that with this mutants, the present vaccinations may be inadequate, and maybe we need to go for boosters or yearly reviews like the influenza. So this is a quick snapshot of what happened last year. Now, when you come back to the therapeutics, this is a very good article published just a couple of months ago. COVID-19 treatment options, a difficult journey between failed attempts and experimental drugs. Okay, so why is this so? It's a snapshot of how many different compounds have been tried in respiration in this year and a half. I have picked up a couple of these which are relevant and had major support from the clinical fraternity in terms of use. Okay? So very early we started with HCQS, hydroxychloroquine sulfate. All of us know how Trump threatened, and we were exporting HCQS to US, and a lot of hype about this being a game changer in terms of management of COVID. Unfortunately, that didn't last long. As evidence started to build up, it was understood that HCQS is not a life-saving drug for COVID, and it was soon done away with. Most of the evidence now supports against that now. Then there was this era of remdesivir, people running around to get plasma. Plasma therapy was in vogue. And the World Health Organization supported the use of steroids with this recovery trial, saying that it is life saving in ventilated patients, sick patients. There was a clear mortality advantage with steroids, and steroids came into play and with much into vogue at that time. Tocilizumab was suggested as an IL-6 inhibitor when many publications came in terms of the cytokine storm playing a very important role in the pathogenesis or complications of COVID. And hence this idea that if you use an anti-IL-6 or IL-6 inhibitor like tocilizumab, you may save more lives. And it still has a role, but not as much as what we used to believe in the early part of the illness. A lot of data publications came around with regard to ivermectin, and in fact, ivermectin gained entry into a lot of state government guidelines, and later at a time even the government of India, the ICMR guidelines for a brief time. Favipiravir also had very limited publications, but it also gained place. A lot of favipiravir was prescribed as outpatients and all, and even a couple of state government guidelines also, including the Kerala government guideline also, favipiravir had a place. And the most recent two drugs which is doing the rounds now is obviously the monoclonal antibody cocktail from Roche, the Regeneron, which is now available in India and it's creating a lot of noise. And we have an immunomodulator, anti-JAK modulator inhibitor called baricitinib, which is there. And then there was this hype about the 2-deoxy-D-glucose, a product which has been discovered by DRDO and launched by Dr. Reddy. So this is the timeline of therapeutics in COVID. If you look at the major players, there are a lot of other drugs. So in April 2021, this is a Nature publication which showed that by November 2020, we had 2,790 molecules being in various phases of clinical trials for COVID. Okay. So if I look at the evidence building up for COVID, by November 2020, we had 2,790 clinical trials for various products. A couple of them were antivirals, couple of them were immunomodulators, there are neutralizing agents like antibodies, and then a combination of these drugs, so various kinds of drugs. However, when you look deeper into what is happening, this 2,790 trials or whatever these trials are happening, this is again published in Nature, May 2021. So it summarized that just an example of hydroxychloroquine, 250 trials of hydroxychloroquine. Okay. While a lot of the initial data said that it does not work. So they termed this as a duplication representing wasted effort. Second was a lot of these studies, in fact, most of them, they were enrolling more than or less than 100 patients. So at this sample strength, that is less than 100 patients, their ability to detect statistically significant clinical outcomes is very, very limited. Meaning whatever information or outcomes come out of the clinical study, we cannot have reliable trust on that because of the small sample size. So just reiterating, a lot of trials in therapeutics going on, but two major drawbacks of all these trials. One, many of them are just doing the same thing again and again in a different setting. So a lot of duplication happening without bringing out any real new information. And two, majority of those trials are not actually enrolling sufficient patients so that the outcome what you get or the results what you get are applicable and gain statistical significance. Slightly earlier this year, that is October 2020, in JAMA, there was an article which looked at the quality of the studies, okay, which was happening for COVID. And it said that less than 30%, okay, that is 29.1% of those registered trial has even the potential to reach level 2 evidence. So even the potential to reach level 2 evidence, forget about level 1, just even the potential to reach level 2 evidence, only 30% or less. Of the randomized controlled trials, again, only about 29% are placebo-controlled blinded studies. So what we understand is that more than 2,000, 2,500 studies, one, lot of them are duplications, two, many of them are of small sample size, and three, the design, the study design itself is ineffective or poor in most of these things. So what happens that even when you have a lot of meta-analysis coming out, it is a story of garbage in, garbage out, right? You put together a lot of poor quality studies, do a meta-analysis, what you come out is still poor quality information. What has been the impact of this explosion of therapeutic evidence? Polypharmacy. Right? We have seen this WhatsApp messages of a lot of prescriptions going on where 15 drugs have been prescribed together. Right? So this was a commentary in this month itself, in fact, June 2nd, 2021 in Lancet Global Health, which was about the low value medical care in pandemic. Is this what the doctor ordered? Primarily focusing on the clinicians prescribing a lot of drugs which are based on very poor evidence or no data at all. So to come back to the topic, so we understand that if I want to talk about therapeutics, newer therapeutics, there is a huge gap in evidence, and what you see in published literature is actually of very, very poor quality. Okay, so that was the first major point which I wanted to make. And based on that, the second thing was that a lot of clinicians were using polypharmacy, prescribing a lot of drugs together without much evidence or scientific basis to do so. So what has been the adverse impact of this? So we know that drug interactions are a major challenge when we use multiple drugs together. And some of these are even new drugs. Some of these are drugs which are used in different doses. We don't even understand, we don't have PKPD studies at all when we combine all these drugs together and give it to the patient. So you could have serious toxicities. All of us are aware that there was a recent publication regarding remdesivir, which highlighted that it can be associated with cardiac toxicity. We know that innocuous sounding drugs like hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, when given together, it had a significant impact in terms of cardiac arrhythmias and cardiac toxicity. Tocilizumab and steroids, we know that it had significant immunomodulation, immunosuppression, and in the critically ill, it resulted in more incidence of infections. And many of these infections contributed to mortality. So polypharmacy in COVID has got a clinical impact. It could have known or unknown drug interactions. It could have drug toxicities, which you would not be able to differentiate between is it due to COVID worsening or it is a drug toxicity. And this will have an impact on the morbidity and mortality of the patient. Immunomodulators, especially when you use newer immunomodulators and in combination with steroids, they are directly related to an increased incidence of infections. And these secondary infections in our country, with a high prevalence of multi-drug resistant organisms in our ICUs, are associated with significant mortality in these patients in the ICU. And that is not all. Fungal infections have made a major leeway into this post-COVID scenario, primarily due to the drugs and also obviously to the disease also, which causes immunodeficiencies and drop in CD4s, etc. So we have a high mortality from co-infections of not just bacterial infections in the ICU, but invasive fungal infections like mucormycosis, which has become a large outbreak or an epidemic after this COVID. So with this perspective, let me now quickly review what are the present recommendations based on the best available quality of evidence which we have. So this document from the American Society of Healthcare Pharmacists, they do an assessment of all the clinical trials published for most of the drugs which are being tried for COVID, and they keep updating it on a regular frequency. So this document which I'm showing is being updated on 27th of May. This is just to showcase you like how many groups and types of drugs have been pushed into clinical trials for COVID. Okay, and out of this, I will just look into and showcase what are the drugs which have good quality of evidence, which are recommended in majority of the global guidelines, and which we can put into clinical practice in a safe way. So hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin were the earliest favorites. Now they are contraindicated. The IDSA committee, which reviewed the evidence, recommends against the use of these drugs in all group of patients, both outpatients, hospitalized, severe, and all groups of patients. Lopinavir, ritonavir, or one of the antiretroviral drugs, protease inhibitor, which again had some recommendations in the early part of last year, that also comes under this group where it is no longer recommended. Okay, so hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and lopinavir, ritonavir are not recommended for treatment of COVID anymore. So steroids and tocilizumab are the next group for which there has been evidence. So green means there has an evidence and they suggest its use. So where do we use steroids and where do you use tocilizumab? So that is the most important question. Yes, there is data to support use, but that use will provide benefit to the patient only if you use it within that window period or the phase of the disease where it has been shown to have mortality benefits. One thing is very clear: we should not use steroids in mild to moderate disease. It has been shown to increase your viral shedding, increase the viral multiplicity, can result in prolonged and complicated disease. Unnecessary immunosuppression will place the patient at risk of secondary infections, including mucormycosis in today's setting. So steroids are not to be used in mild to moderate disease, but definitely they have to be used in an ICU patient. The recovery trial had hard endpoints of mortality and 28-day mortality, which showed benefit of steroids in these ventilated patients on oxygen support and ventilator. And hence, in that group, this is something which you definitely have to consider, and you should not consider this in mild to moderate disease. Tocilizumab, the evidence is much lower quality compared to steroids. The recommendations are very, very specific. You use tocilizumab within 24 hours of steroid failure. So first line, still in a deteriorating patient, is steroids. So after 24 hours of steroids, there is still respiratory decompensation and the CRP levels are more than 75, which is an indicator of cytokine release syndrome or significant pro-inflammatory response in the patient. Okay, so you should have a documented pro-inflammatory response measured by CRP. There is no recommendation to focus on IL-6 measurements at all. None of the therapeutic guidelines recommend IL-6 based treatment options. Okay, even if tocilizumab is an anti-IL-6 inhibitor, both the clinical trials where it was used and the guidelines specify only CRP, which is available to all of us and quite cheap, of more than 75 as a cutoff and indicator to consider whether you want to start tocilizumab. So it is not just the CRP. You should use it within 24 hours of respiratory depression after steroid failure. The best time to use it is before the patient reaches the ICU or just as soon as the patient reaches the ICU with respiratory decompensation, before a lot of lines and tubes are inserted and the patient has got prolonged ICU stay, which places him at a much higher risk of secondary infections. Also, in clinical practice, we do not recommend it against people with multi-organ dysfunction or significant comorbidities or very elderly, because again, all these people are at a higher risk of secondary infections and tocilizumab will just make that worse. The third drug which has got a place in today's therapy is remdesivir. This is, even though WHO has not recommended it with good quality evidence, and it has showed that in fact the WHO has termed that there is no evidence. However, most of the other global guidelines, including the European and the US guidelines and our own national guidelines, they still place remdesivir for a particular group of patients. Like how for steroids and tocilizumab, there was patient selection. Exactly in the same way for remdesivir also, there is a specific patient group. So very, very important that it does not benefit the critically ill on ventilator. So it is not a life-saving drug for somebody who is in a bad shape for days in the ICU on ventilator. It is not meant for that patient at all. It will not benefit that patient at all. It has to be used in hospitalized patient at the time when they require supplemental oxygen within 10 days of illness. Why? Because that is the maximum active viremia period which has been noted in most of these studies. So they say that since it's an antiviral, the idea is to use it in the early viremic phase. After 10 days, it is assumed that the disease progresses to immune phase from the viremic phase, and hence remdesivir beyond 10 days initiation is not considered to be useful. There was head-to-head comparison between 5 days of remdesivir and 10 days of remdesivir. Both were found to be same. So hence we no longer recommend using it beyond 5 days. So remdesivir, important points: do not attempt in critically ill on ventilator. Do not use it after 10 days of illness in a late presenting patient. use it early within 10 days of illness, hospitalized patient who require supplemental oxygen. So that's what the evidence for remdesivir is now. Beyond this, in clinical practice, we also prescribe remdesivir to people who have comorbidities and have persistent fever or worsening CT or X-ray infiltrates if they are still within this 10 days. So they may not actually go on to require supplemental oxygen, though most of the data or hard data is supporting for people on supplemental oxygen. Sometimes if there is a evidence of active clinical progression in terms of persistent fever, worsening infiltrates, and even though they may not gone into requiring supplemental oxygen, if they're in the early phase, we still use remdesivir. Now coming to the newer drugs, the monoclonal antibodies. So what is available in India is the casirivimab plus imdevimab combination, not the other one, the bevacizumab and itesivimab combination. So this combination by Roche, Regeneron, the brand name, this has to be always be used in combination. The hard data or the larger trials are for non-hospitalized patients or OP patients. However, we should realize that there have been further trials in mild to moderate disease patients, including those patients with low flow oxygen. Okay? So the majority of the initial trials for monoclonal antibodies were done in patients with mild disease immediately at the time of diagnosis, within a day or two after the time of diagnosis. These patients had, or the outcome or the benefit was highest when these patients had a low baseline antibodies and when they had a high viral load. Okay, so what does this mean? High viral load means it will do benefit only in the early phase of illness, right? So that is first thing to remember. So within 1 week of illness is what is recommended. 2, low baseline antibodies can happen in 2 or 3 scenarios. Either they are uninfected and not vaccinated, or they are infected, but it has been a while after infection and they are still unvaccinated. 3, they are vaccinated, but the antibody generation or the antibody produced are inadequate or insufficient, or they are only at a lower line. Where does this happen? For immunocompromised population, the oncology patients, the organ transplantation patients, for the bone marrow transplant patients, for all these patients, in spite of vaccination, their antibody levels are expected to be low, even chronic kidney disease patient or dialysis, etc. It has been shown that even with the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, in oncology population, a single dose produces sufficient antibody levels only in less than 40%. And even the second dose of mRNA Pfizer vaccine produces sufficient antibodies only in about 60% of these patients. So hence, immunosuppressed patients, even if they're vaccinated, they would still come under this indicated list. So you have to use monoclonal antibodies early, within 1 week. You have to look at patients who would likely have low antibody levels. There is no recommendation to test antibodies. It always comes as a cocktail, 2 antibodies together. Why? Because it reduces the risk of resistance with a variant when you have 2 antibodies binding at 2 different sites. Though the earlier classical trials were for ambulatory outpatients, the later trials for these monoclonal antibodies has been for hospitalized patients with mild to moderate disease up to those who are on low flow oxygen. A newer indication of post-exposure prophylaxis is also coming up. There is a trial which has been undergone for that also, where the results are awaited. That means if you have or if I get COVID-19 and I have a vulnerable family member at home, I have an elderly parent or somebody immunosuppressed at home, I can probably consider giving this to the vulnerable patient or the vulnerable person at home as a post-exposure prophylaxis. So there are trials coming up for that also. The last new drug is baricitinib. This has been strictly recommended in combination only, not as a single standalone drug. The combination is with remdesivir, and the recommendation are for non-ventilated patients. So this is again something you start early. So we know that remdesivir, we start within 10 days of illness. So this is something you start early with remdesivir as a combination therapy. Primarily, this has been recommended when steroids are contraindicated or are not required. Okay, we know that steroids we give towards the later phase on ventilator and oxygen supplementation. So this is not that phase. This is again not for the seriously ill patient. This is again for patients who might require oxygen supplementation but low flow and do not require ventilation before 10 days of the illness. So, though there are a lot of adverse events listed out for baricitinib, they are less likely with the short-term use. So, we use 1 tablet a day for about 2 weeks for this indication, while this for various other common rheumatological and onco indications, this is used as long-term. So, some of the adverse events listed are reactivation of tuberculosis and opportunistic fungal infections because this is an immunomodulator. Lymphomas has been listed as a rare side effects. Venous thromboembolism, both deep vein thrombus and pulmonary thromboembolism has been listed. Incidence of GI perforations has been listed. Hypersensitivity reactions, mild liver enzyme elevations, and cytopenias, including anemias, leukopenia, and thrombocytopenia, which we have to keep a watch for. So these are the rare possible side effects with baricitinib. What are the issues with monoclonal antibody cocktails? The major adverse events are with regard to infusion-related reactions, primarily chills, fever, headache, and myalgias. Rarely you may have hypersensitive reactions, including anaphylaxis, and that is the reason that these antibody cocktails are recommended to be administered as a slow infusion under observation with a post-infusion period of 30 minutes observation. So you come in, get your infusion 20 to 30 minutes, or even you can get a subcutaneous injection of this, and then you wait, have an observation period of another half an hour to make sure that hypersensitive reactions, including anaphylaxis, is not there. And obviously, cost is one of the concerns. It is quite expensive, a single dose, about 60,000 rupees. Patient selection, I'm just reiterating here, which is strictly recommended because of its cost. You should select a patient who has high risk of complications from COVID. Okay, so that is an immunosuppressed, severe underlying lung or heart disease, obesity, or pregnancy. So these are the group who would have the maximum benefit if you are able to prevent a complication. Then you should select out of these who have inadequate protective antibodies. So these could be unvaccinated or non-infected, or vaccinated with an inadequate response, like oncology, rheumatology, transplant patients, and elderly. So thymosin alpha is a drug which has been used around much, especially in the critical care setting, primarily with a lot of theory. Both in the early phase, it was shown to reduce it was postulated that it will reduce the progression into severe disease or pneumonia by immunomodulation, improving the T cell response. In critically ill, again, it was postulated that thymosin alpha will reduce the cytokine storm and hence will prevent deterioration and organ failures. However, the April 2021 meta-analysis of the few trials which looked at it, only 4 or 5 major good trials were there. It did not show any mortality benefit. Okay, so thymosin alpha, data-wise, evidence-wise, no impact on mortality. The last drug which I want to talk about, the newest one, is the 2-deoxyglucose. So many of you would have seen this WhatsApp message which was according our DRDO scientist in terms of producing this drug, showing cheating the cheater, that it sort of mimics the glucose, and the virus takes in thinking that it is glucose, and then its metabolism is inhibited, etc., etc. However, when you look at the data, it is dismal. Okay, there is no peer-reviewed trial data available at all. The publicly shared information, which is from the Dr. Reddy's webinar, which both DRDO and a few of the clinicians participated, was of extremely poor quality research, and major issues, major challenges like trial endpoints being not clarified, which is one of the serious thing that how can we consider a study of when the trial endpoints itself are dynamic or not clarified. So people who are more interested in this, they can go through this article published in the Wire. Dr. Reddy's revealed more about 2DG, and his approval is now more confusing. So this is a detailed article on why this trial has problems. So to summarize the available therapeutics which we have, with the literature review as recent as June 2021, and as I told you, as months progress, just like how hydroxychloroquine is no longer recommended, many of these drugs may go out of wake. But as what we know today, on one side I have put the drugs which are approved based on reasonable evidence, and on the right side I have put when to use the drug in terms of indication. Okay. So remdesivir the personal experience has been quite safe. However, I have to note here that there has been a recent alert on the cardiotoxicity associated with remdesivir. Within 10 days of illness in hospitalized patient with oxygen support but non-ventilated. But as I mentioned, in clinical practice, we also give it to patients who have persistent fever beyond 1 week with developing or progressing infiltrates on chest X-ray. Tocilizumab, we avoid in patients with prolonged ICU stay, lines and tubes, severe comorbid illness, which predisposes them to serious secondary infections. So where do we give? We give them in low-risk patients within 24 hours of respiratory decompensation with a CRP of more than 75 and after trying steroids for 24 to 48 hours. Steroids, budesonide inhaled, there has been one peer-reviewed RCT called the STOIC study, and one multicentric non-peer-reviewed RCT. That's the evidence for it, nothing more. But it is there it had a place in the national guidelines at a time. That's why I'm bringing it out. We use it in mild disease at 800 microgram 12th hourly for 4 to 10 days. In various trials, that was the duration, and it was shown to reduce the risk of acute hospitalization. So that is the place for budesonide. Systemic steroid, dexamethasone or methylprednisolone, we have to have a strict watch on glycemic control. We use it for all ICU patients for 5 to 10 days. We also sometimes use it when the patients have rapidly progressing CT or chest X-ray findings with fever, even though they may not be ventilated at that time. Baricitinib, it is not recommended in liver kidney dysfunction patients, and the risk of infection is high if you are using it along with steroids. So it is used instead of steroids or without steroids. It is used in combination with remdesivir in hospitalized patients, again, who could have oxygen supplementation. Monoclonal antibodies, they are reasonably safe, but their number needed to treat is actually quite high. It's between 25 to 30, meaning if you take all COVID patients, mild COVID patients, you have to give monoclonal antibodies to 25 to 30 of these patients for one patient to get a benefit. Hence, we have to do better patient selection. So we do better patient selection by giving it early, 7 to 10 days of illness, looking at patients who could have poor antibody levels, who could have high viral load levels, and who are at high risk for complications from COVID. That's how we prioritize this monoclonal antibody. The systematic review of all the therapeutics used for COVID shows that the success of that particular drug depends on the phase of illness where it was used. Okay, so that is very, very important to remember that if be it steroids, be it remdesivir, be it tocilizumab, be it baricitinib, you have to give to the patient only at that particular phase of illness. So before and after that, it does not improve outcomes. So it's very, very important to recognize that and then decide on your therapy. So I try to put it up in a simpler fashion with the disease phase and the drug. So you have somebody with a mild disease with no risk factors for progression or complication. He is either vaccinated or is a young guy who is likely to have good immunogenicity from the vaccine. Then probably I will not give him any of these drugs. He will be among that 80% who would get better on their own. Budesonide meter dose inhaler could be considered, not much side effects, cheap. So in at least one RCT to show to reduce risk of hospitalization. So maybe you can try that at that point. Somebody with a mild to moderate disease with risk factors, a non-vaccinated person, even though if it is a mild disease, or somebody with poor immunogenicity, even though if it is mild to or moderate disease, but no oxygen requirement. Here I would probably consider monoclonal antibody cocktail with or without the budesonide meter dose inhaler. Now, third category is somebody with moderate disease, that is, he has got features of pneumonia with oxygen requirement and is hospitalized, but he is non-ventilated. Now, if I am able to reach to him within 24 hours of worsening and after steroid use, I would probably give him tocilizumab. Remdesivir and baricitinib has a role here in this phase, that is moderate disease with oxygen requirement in hospitalized patients. Remdesivir and steroids in non-ventilated in a very select category, as I told you, rapidly worsening lung infiltrates. So I would probably give it early, even though they may not be ventilated. severe disease and ventilated. Okay, so these are people who are beyond 1 week of illness and they are already on ventilator with ARDS. So here, remdesivir and baricitinib and monoclonal antibodies, etc., do not work. So steroids are the mainstay of treatment for COVID as an immunomodulator here, and maybe tocilizumab within 24 hours of worsening. Okay. So this is how I would categorize the disease to understand the phase in which the patient is and try to match the available therapeutic options to the patient category. So key messages and summary for today. There has been an evidence explosion. You see more than 2,500 studies, but the quality of evidence has been poor, including meta-analysis of various types, particularly ivermectin, lot of meta-analysis for ivermectin, but all derived from studies of poor quality. So hence, garbage in, garbage out principle, we can't believe most of the studies which are coming out. Polypharmacy or throw the kitchen sink approach has been very, very common among the clinical fraternity, especially when the patient has been quite sick. This is because of the poor understanding or due to poor application of the available evidence. To understand that if somebody is beyond a week of illness on ventilator with ARDS, remdesivir or monoclonal antibodies or tocilizumab, etc., are not going to save him. Polypharmacy and therapeutic trials have led to drug toxicities because of drug interactions and immunosuppression, outbreaks of opportunistic infections, and all these have resulted in poor clinical outcomes. So polypharmacy using many drugs which we don't understand well together will have an adverse clinical impact. A critical review of evidence, as I shared with you now, show that only a handful of therapeutic options should be considered at all, and that also only in appropriate setting. Okay, so you need to understand and place the patient in a particular disease stage and try to match the drugs which are available now with a reasonable evidence and use that in that particular patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranup. Wonderful, at the same time, very candid kind of statements about garbage in, garbage out. I think, the polypharmacy, which has been really victimizing a lot of our patients rather than saving. I think, they are very, very valid comments. And I think a lot of people who have attended today's session, probably they will start rationalizing, because the valid point what you made is that either lack of knowledge or rational application of the knowledge, if it is absent, we will be putting more of our patients through the pain and misery than helping them to come out of already worse situation they are in. I think that's absolutely a valid point. I think there are questions. Maybe Pranavji, you want to actually pose some of the questions to Dr. Anup. One question, Dr. Anup, while actually Mr. Pranav is getting ready with the questions from the audience. Now, we had this long journey of hits and misses with every kind of therapeutic element which is available. Is this these two things, like the cocktail, monoclonal antibody cocktail, and also 2DG, are also going to come into the same category with a very low evidence, and they are going to be put into the dustbin very soon, or they are really having some potential? Of course, you did explain, but maybe just for clarity, can you actually give once again your very sharp comment on that?
So the monoclonal antibody cocktail and 2DG cannot be placed on the same platform at all. Okay, because for the monoclonal antibody cocktail, there has been RCTs, large sample RCTs, still ongoing RCTs with different clinical indications, peer-reviewed literature, and it has found a place in the NIH and IDSA guideline reviews. So it has got a lot of evidence to back it up. And the trick about the monoclonal antibody is primarily two. One is that, as I mentioned, the number needed to treat was very high in the largest trial, which advised it or recommended it for non-hospitalized patient in ambulatory setting to prevent hospitalization and ICU admission. It was between 25 to 30. So the crux is that if you indiscriminately give monoclonal antibody to everybody, you have to give to up to 30 people for one patient to get the benefit. So 30 people have to spend 60,000 each for one patient to get the benefit, right? So hence you have to narrow it down to a group who would have the maximum benefit. So here is where the application of the details of the trial, like where they found the highest benefit. They found highest benefit when the viral load was high. They found highest benefit when the pre-existing antibody levels were very low. So we have to try out that group of people, and probably the people at highest risk for complications, like already damaged lungs or cardiomyopathy, or obviously immunosuppressed group, oncology or CKD group, etc. And then maybe you need to treat maybe 5 or 6 people for one patient to get benefit, and it might be actually be worth it. So that is the placement of that. 2DG, as I told you, it has got no peer-reviewed publications at all, and it's the clinical trial, phase 3 trials had a lot of holes in it. Hence, it will nowhere come anywhere near the other drugs which I described.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this question is also actually asked in the same topic, so I thought to keep it here also. Dr. Sangeeta Sampath, she says that are we justified in monoclonal antibody use? On this drive another variant to emerge?
So the idea of combining the two different types of thing and giving us two different monoclonal antibodies was with that with this the whole idea that we will try to reduce the development of newer variants who would escape this particular group. Already the in the US and all, the Bevacizumab, which is the other one which we don't have, it has already shown that our Delta variants and even the UK variants, etc., don't have much action, or it doesn't neutralize those. So the antibody cocktail which we are having, its impact on the Delta variant and the new Delta plus variant. Okay? So these are still to be estimated. So we know that in UK variant and the other Brazil, South Africa, and the earlier variants, we know that this present monoclonal antibody cocktail works. Okay? There are proven studies on that. With the Indian or the Delta variant and the new Delta plus, there the trials are yet to emerge. Pre-print studies or the in vitro studies for Delta variant exits. So they claim that it works against Delta, but I have yet to see it in published literature as a peer-reviewed thing. So just like for the previous antibody which was used in US, resistance emerged and it was not effective against the newer variants, the present monoclonal antibody also might prove that the newer variants, it will not be as effective against the newer variants. However, a combination of two reduces this risk, but definitely it still exists.
Thank you.
I think there are a couple of more questions from the audience. I think we have another 9 minutes before we could close. There is one question from Dr. Raksha Bhatt. Can you throw light on any significant drug interactions of these newer drugs? Anything that is of concern and needs to be kept in mind?
So if I select the drugs which I described, the remdesivir, the baricitinib, tocilizumab, steroids, and budesonide, like, so you just have 5 drugs to remember, nothing more than that. So in that, the remdesivir is the only one where there was this red flagging regarding its cardiotoxicity when used in this extremely ill patients. So other than that, the rest of them, including baricitinib, does not have any other serious drug interactions. So that is the reason I am suggesting to keep things simple. Just limit to 3-4 drugs, and maybe at each phase you have just 1 or 2 drugs, right? In a severe patient you have just 2 drugs. In a moderate group you have just 1 or 2 drugs, and in a mild you have just 1 drug. So that is the safe way to go.
Thank you. One more question from Dr. Dilip Kumar Mishra. For patients with limited availability of resources, drug selection is challenging. Critically ill on oxygen with mask maintaining 70-80%, or with the CPAP more than 88% with known DM and HTN. Kindly suggest the best options.
So if I summarize, he comes under the moderate to severe, because this is somebody who is at a high risk, diabetic and hypertensive. 2, he is already requiring oxygen supplementation and with a non-invasive ventilation. So in that category, the drugs which we would recommend are, if he's in the early phase, that is within the first 7 to 10 days of illness, and if remdesivir is available, that finds a place here. Baricitinib also finds a place here, which is the data suggests to give it along with remdesivir. If you have remdesivir, then baricitinib. Baricitinib is not expensive. The Indian generic comes at about 30 rupees per tab or something, so it is not an expensive drug. Somebody with oxygen supplementation, if you keep aside the remdesivir as an expensive drug and baricitinib as a new one which you don't want to try, steroid definitely has a place here because there is some factor. So definitely dexamethasone or methylprednisolone, either of these two. Based on your resources, you can choose whether to keep remdesivir with or with baricitinib.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anup. Once again, I think Mr. Ramdas, baton to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anup. I think it was wonderful. The slides were very clear, immaculate. That's what I would say. You know, at SANMED, we have taken this baton of really providing a platform for the very relevant topics, which is the need of the hour. And probably that is how we have come out with this series, which is, you know, the learnings from the second wave and how we should look at for the third wave, what preparations we need to do it. We couldn't have done it, you know, more on this with the kind of topics we have chosen. And your subtopic, Dr. Warrier, today was one of the most relevant, I would say, because it has got so much of a confusion going on in the medical fraternity and so many doubts going on there. I thought that, you know, this made a lot of sense for us. This has been a wonderful program. Overall, the first two sessions are over. We have the third and the fourth going to come the coming weeks, and the final one, which is a panel discussion on 6th of July. So thank you so much. And thank you very much to all the participants who have taken out time out of your busy schedules. I'm sure this is a time when you're all pressed for time, and coming to listen to this kind of a program. It's a burst, like 1 hour, and I think a lot of information which comes in. So thank you, Dr. Anup Warrier, for the wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Ranga, and yeah, Mr. Pranav for you know, hosting it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.